question I'm sure going through your mind is, well, how do we get started? Because it can seem like a very overwhelming and complicated process. I have one of our clients, a new client that I was working with in California recently. She was, they have just signed up to do some international nurse recruitment, and she was really very anxious and saying that, it just felt very overwhelming, very complicated, hard to know where to start. And that's where I think I'm really excited that everybody is attending today, because I think that it can give you a very good bird's overview of the different pieces of the puzzle. So it's important to break this process down into a step-by-step approach and identify the key elements. And really, we've identified there are 4 basic key elements to international nurse recruitment. And you've got to kind of think of it as 4 main headings or umbrella topics. So the first is the licensing and credentialing, and I'm going to go through that in a bit more detail with you on further slides. The second is the immigration piece. The third is the recruitment and selection process. And fourth is the onboarding best practice, successful onboarding best practice. So under the licensing and credentialing umbrella, for want of a better word, there are a number of processes that the nurses need to go through in order to meet the U.S. credentialing requirements. The first is that they need to, seem to have skipped ahead. The first is that the nurses need to pass the NCLEX exam. Of course, this is the biggest barrier of entry because this is administered by the National Council of State Boards of Nursing, the NCSBN, which tests the nurse competency. And all nurses that want to come and live and work in the U.S. need to pass the NCLEX before they can start working and even start the immigration process. Another credentialing requirement is that if the nurses were trained in English, they don't need to pass the English exam, of course. But if they were not trained in English, they do need to pass the English exam. And there are 2 different kinds of exams that the nurses can take in order to meet the U.S. criteria. The one is called the IELTS, the other is called the TOEFL, and nurses need to get a specific required score in order to pass the English exam. So this can also give one peace of mind to know that anybody that is going to be working in the U.S. coming from outside the country needs to, of course, pass the NCLEX exam. But if they were not trained in English, it gives you a peace of mind to know that they've had to pass an English exam as well in order to qualify to work in the U.S. Another piece of the puzzle is for the credentialing requirements is the visa screen certificate. And I'm going to discuss that in a bit more detail in a future slide. But just to give you an overview, the visa screen certificate is a document that all international nurses need to get from an organization in Philadelphia. It's a non-profit immigration organization called the CGFNS, and they will evaluate the transcripts of the nurses in order to make sure that transcripts and the educational background of the nurses in order to make sure that the nurses' education is equivalent to an American nurse. They will also make sure that the nurses pass the English before they issue that visa screen, if that is a requirement that they have not taken their nursing education in English. And then, of course, the nurses would need the license endorsement if necessary. So every state has a different requirement in terms of the process for the nurses to take the NCLEX. There are many states in the U.S. where nurses can't go directly to that state to take the NCLEX through that state. So, for instance, there are actually a lot of states. I'm not going to actually mention them all by name, but they are. The reason is because many of the nursing boards in the U.S. require a social security number in order to take the NCLEX. And of course, these nurses would not have a social security number because they are not yet authorized to work in the U.S. They don't have a green card or a TN visa or something like that. So how that works with international nurses is that there are certain states, and New York is actually one of the states where they can write without a social security number. And that means that if they're going to be working in New York, that's a simple process. But if they're going to be working in another state, then they would need to do what's called a license endorsement. And there is a process for doing that step. Still under that licensing and credentialing umbrella, a little bit more about the visa screen certificate. So the visa screen certificate is a document that we need for all nurses in order to qualify to actually apply for a green card or for a TN visa. And I'm going to go through in future slides a little bit more about the green card or the TN, but a bit more about the visa screen. So it is a certificate. It's issued by CGFNS. This is an immigration nonprofit organization that validates the academic credentials of foreign educated healthcare professionals. Once it's issued, the visa screen is valid for 5 years, and the nurses can renew it every 5 years. So they again have to meet the criteria for the visa screen, but it can be renewed. The CGFNS will confirm that the nurse's education is comparable to a U.S. nurse. So this definitely can give one a lot of peace of mind. In fact, most international nurses actually have a bachelor's degree. So some of them are actually even more qualified than American nurses, as many American nurses only have a associate's degree or diploma. As I said, if the nurse wasn't trained in English, the CGFNS verifies that the nurse is proficient in the written and spoken English, and the RNs must pass the NCLEX and be eligible to obtain a license in one of the US states.